My name is Samuel Priddock. Welcome to this episode of Literary Debates. Today we will be discussing post-colonialist theories and debating racism within Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. To my right, I have Nigerian novelist and educator Dr. Chinua Achebe, an expert in the field of African literature and a well-known critic of Conrad's novel. Most famous for controversially calling Conrad a thoroughbred racist. To my left is Emeritus Professor of English Cedric. He is a widely known defender of Conrad, viewing his text from a completely different perspective. Now, for those not familiar with Joseph Conrad, he was a Polish-British writer considered one of the best modernist novel writers of the 20th century, having written many stories that depict the inner spirit of the human psyche. There is evidence that Conrad visited Africa as a child and was instantly inspired to return there later on in life. In quotes from his autobiographical book, A Personal Record, he talks of how he was fascinated by Africa as a child and how he always had the intention to return. Many years later he returned, as he said he would, but by the time he reached the Congo, it had become the property of the Belgian king Leopold II. He witnessed there the economic exploitation of goods such as rubber, ivory, oil and precious metals. Conrad's trip was cut short, but he was left with a greater moral and emotional maturity, which confirmed him in his new vocation as a writer. Conrad clearly drew on his personal experiences of the colonisation, and his novel reflects aspects of Eurocentric domination. Heart of Darkness has been widely criticised and debated as a racist text due to its portrayal of indigenous inhabitants of the Congo. Increasingly, in the last 20 years or so, Heart of Darkness has been read not only as an inquiry into the nature of colonialism, but as a severe denunciation of it, and as an illustration of Joseph Conrad's own ambivalent attitude towards imperialism. At the same time, it questions the value of white civilization and the desirability of its transplantation to what were then considered as primitive countries. Several critics have asserted that in Heart of Darkness, Conrad criticised Belgian colonialism only, but approved of the work being done by the British in their colonies. Now, if anyone would like to get involved and share their views on this debate, please tweet us using the hashtag #TheRaceDebate. So, enough introduction from me. Achebe, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you wrote a very famous essay for your lectures in African Studies at the University of Massachusetts. In the essay, you accused Conrad of being a thoroughbred racist. Do you still hold that opinion?
I do, Sam, but I would like to say that Heart of Darkness is an interesting text and one which I have studied immensely. Conrad is undoubtedly one of the great stylists of modern fiction and a good storyteller into the bargain. Yet, there are several instances throughout the novel where it is blatantly clear that Conrad is verbally attacking the black indigenous people. I mean, his own account of his first ever encounter with a black man is quite revealing. In A Personal Record, he states, and I've got a copy of it here, he states that a certain enormous buck nigger encountered in Haiti fixed my conception of blind, furious, unreasoning rage as manifested in the human animal to the end of my days. Of the nigger, I used to dream for years afterwards.
So then, how do you feel about the use of that word in particular?
Well, I mean, certainly Conrad seemed to like the word nigger. He used it quite often enough, and he seemed to have a problem with dark-skinned, provided by his excessive use of the word. Conrad would nowadays certainly be of interest to psychoanalysts. It isn't like he only uses the word once either. If you read through the book, he uses it several times, even into double figures.
You've got to consider that the use of the M-word was not offensive at this time. It wasn't offensive until many years later, following the Black Civil Rights Movement. Therefore, this point is invalid.
Well, no, because his recollection of his first encounter at the age of 16 with a white Englishman is significantly different.
He was simply creating a contrast.
Well, again, I've got a copy of that here as well, with how he speaks about his first encounter with a white man. I'll read this to you. His calves exposed, the public gaze dazzled the beholder by the splendour of their marble-like condition and their rich tone of young ivory. The light of a headlong, exalted satisfaction with the world of men illumined his face and triumphant eyes. In passing, he cast a glance of kindly curiosity and a friendly gleam of big, sound, shiny teeth. His white calves twinkled sturdily. So compare that to the way he describes the first time he ever encountered a black person. I mean, he speaks of the Englishman with enlightenment. He sees brightened eyes, further the intellectual differences between the white men and the savages, who can barely communicate when he describes the black people. Not only does he criticise the appearance of them, he assumes that they're not as intelligently advanced as the white European, something which I find enormously offensive. And in my opinion, this is the only excuse that colonisers used to justify it, to justify why they colonised places and to bring civilisation. The reality is there was and is nothing civil about colonialism. It just destroys communities and it destroys lives.
Now, what? I know you happen to disagree with Achebe.
Yes.
Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Achebe. I understand what you're saying, but I just think it's ludicrous that you appear to suggest that only valid criticism of Heart of Darkness is your own.
Not at all.
You seem to believe no white man can appropriately judge the text because of his own preconceived racial prejudices. But you yourself are forgetting the history of the text. This is what I'm talking about. We live in a very different time to that of Conrad. Therefore, we view things with very different eyes. This novel was written in the early 1900s, towards the end of Queen Victoria's reign, and imperialism was imperative to the expansion of civilised culture. The utilisation of Africa was vital to the economic expansion of Europe. History tells us that this was true fact. Back then, the white Europeans were more advanced than any other race. People believed that. There was scientific evidence to prove it. Do people believe in science now? Yes, they do. We don't question science now, so why would our ancestors question science then?
Yes, but European science was seeking validation for their crimes against the black people. Of course science would correlate to the white man's dominant ideology to help ease the guilt and alleviate the internal resistance. What guilt? You said it yourself, you don't question science. So therefore the defence proffered that Conrad should not be judged by the standards of later times, that racism had not become an issue in the world when he wrote Heart of Darkness. It were only just over 100 years ago. These people need to clarify just whose world it talks about. The world belonging to the white man, or the world belonging to the white man or the black man.
You're accusing white people of corrupting the progress of science for their own self-gratification.
Well, it should fit.
Science was not as sophisticated as it is now. Theories have been proven wrong. I accept that, but the point I'm making is people believed it. People believe what they are told.
When I wrote this essay, I did consider several ways in which it could be interpreted, which my essay could be interpreted by other people. Now, the first being the idea that Heart of Darkness is just a work of fiction, designed to entertain the mass audience.
It's a work of fiction.
And the time and not appease the black people it misrepresents. But it does misrepresent the black people. This view is wrong.
It's a story.
This view is wrong, as the text in question is not merely a novel with a few racial slurs, but a novel which questions the humanity of the African people. It degrades them. I myself was very young when Conrad created this novel. Yet I refuse to accept the historical representation of a man like Conrad whose views I consider to be corrupt.
Now, you're both making very valid points, and I can see why this is a very tricky subject, but perhaps we should look at some passages from the novel itself.
Yeah, I would like to actually. I've got a couple that I've actually highlighted, which I don't think even you can argue with.
They are racially offensive, but it does not mean that is the author speaking through his characters.
Well, let me just read this to you, please. We are accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could look at the thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were... No, they were not inhuman. Well, you know, that was the worst of it, this suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it, which you so remote from the night of the first ages, could comprehend.
Yes, Achebe, we are aware that you have discussed this particular passage previously. Now I have here a written statement from one Carl Phillips,
Right.
a fan of both yourself and Conrad, who attempts to understand your criticism and interviewed you about your lecture.
A thoroughly agreeable chap.
So this is what Carl stated. I was, and still am, an admirer of Conrad. But after meeting with Achebe, I experienced an unexpected epiphany. I find Achebe to be a very mild-mannered man, and after spending 2 hours with him, I am convinced that many of his points do appear to be valid. I have never viewed Conrad as a thoroughgoing racist, but I feel now it is difficult to ignore some of the concealed connotations that Conrad represents, and his complete failure to give African people any reasonable level of humanity. I can also not refute the apparent attempt that Conrad has taken to deliberately distance himself from the views of his characters. By making the novel a meta-narrative, it masks his personal views, yet he can still express these through the representation of his characters. I am of the opinion that the representation of Africans in a negative light, presented in Heart of Darkness, was an idea not originated by Conrad, but an already established typecast. But Conrad does not do anything to challenge this. He even suggests that Africans in the novel have rudimentary souls. Now, I am not an African, but if I were, I would feel the same way as Achebe following this comment. The fact of the matter is that many people at the time Heart of Darkness was published would read the depiction of African people and see it as facts, which would develop a complete misrepresentation of African people as inhumane savages with little evidence to the contrary. I have even felt ashamed that I might have overlooked how offensive the novel might be to a man such as Achebe and to millions of other Africans, and accept on my part that I may have been labouring under a misapprehension when it comes to assuming that Achebe's essay on Conrad was groundless.
It's an interesting point, but I think people are too easily offended these days. The meta-narration is Conrad's way of telling the audience that these are not his views. It's obvious. Many texts are prejudiced in some form, one way or another. If we criticised every single text that's offended someone, we wouldn't have any text left. Simply the views of the character. It's a comment on the time. This element of the plot is a social commentary of the time, a time where certain views were acceptable.
Well, no, it's not, because Conrad uses many attempts to distance himself from racist texts. He relates the text third hand through his dual narrators. The tale is that,
to show that he's not racist.
No, the tale is that of Marlowe, yet the novel is related by a second unknown narrator. Yet Conrad fails to discuss any alternative whatsoever, any alternative approach to the racism of the text, so that a reader can judge the characters and situations differently. I believe that Conrad approves of Marlowe's racism, with only minor reservations, a fact reinforced by the similarities between their two careers. And either way, Africans are depicted in a very negative light.
What he was talking about, I'm not denying that.
Right, you give me one example from the text where they are portrayed positively, because I can give you plenty where Africans are represented as inferior, inhuman savages, and this is the problem. For example, I do have another piece in the text that I'd like to read. He was there below me, and upon my word, to look at him was as edifying as seeing a dog in a parody of breeches and a feather hat walking on his hind legs. Tell me, how is that not racist and offensive to a black person? Do you have an example of Conrad offering an alternative to this representation? Because I very much doubt it.
I do. You talk about Marlowe's encounter with the natives, the indigenous people on the bank of the river.
Yes.
Here Conrad appears to show an alternative view to the savage nature of the natives and the oppressive nature of the Europeans. Conrad shows a fascination within Marlowe for the more primitive existence, the existence we see finally realised by Kurt, the character who has gone native. Marlowe's recollection states, "What thrilled you was just the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar." So if Conrad's so fixed in his portrayal of the savages as inhuman, why does he then allow his characters to display the ideas that go against the grain of the Eurocentric ideology?
The point I'm trying to make is simply that to highlight the reasoning behind Western fascination with the native African life, Conrad then going on to state that the existence these savages lead is ugly would appear to confirm this view of Conrad's belief in white superiority, contradicting exactly what you just said.
Of course there's a fascination with different civilisations, but I honestly believe that Conrad is just commenting on the hypocrisy of these civilising missions.
Hypocrisy.
The civil and the savage are indistinguishable from each other throughout the text. It's obvious if you read it from a critical approach. The title of the novel, Heart of Darkness, is also another double-edged sword. Is the Heart of Darkness representative of the evil souls of the colonisers? Is it a metaphor for the Belgian Congo itself? Or is it the dark patch of the map which is yet to be explored? We don't know, but this is what I'm saying. It strengthens my argument that Conrad has been very clever, he's been very bold and astute in his attack on imperialism. He's hidden it carefully behind techniques so as not to be a direct criticism of the powers of his time. These various layers distance the author from the prejudiced views of the characters and the readers themselves.
So do you not think The Heart of Darkness could then be another racial slur on top of a book full of racial slurs? I mean,
It could, but there's no proof for it at all.
but the thing is, you're not African, and if you were, I can assure you, you would find this text deeply offensive, no doubt about it.
Well, you both obviously feel very strongly about your own personal opinions. But either way, I think we can all agree that Conrad is in no doubt a great writer, regardless of his views on race. And we here all disagree with racism
Yes.
in any form.
We do.
We apologise if this debate may have offended any of our viewers. Now, there's been a huge response on Twitter, and it seems that the jury is straight down the middle. At Dr. Samantha Farnham has tweeted, "I have been delivering lectures on this text for many years now, and have studied the theories around it in great depth. I agree with Achebe. Conrad is a racist. You only have to look at other texts from the same time period to realise this. Racism was already recognised at this point. He knew what he was doing. Racism was very much an active topic then, as it is now."
Nowhere near as much.
But that's my point, that is exactly my point.
However, at the other side, Professor Adam Johnson disagrees. He tweeted, "Achebe needs to get a grip. This text was written over 100 years ago. If you ask me, Conrad is a genius.
He's a great writer.
His critique of imperialism has raised awareness and stirred up a great debate. Overall, Conrad is an artist."
A con artist.
Now, I'm sadly afraid we've run out of time for today, though there is far more we could discuss. I don't think we will ever be able to fully establish Conrad's true motives in his representation of African people within his novel. It's a highly controversial subject, and I'm sure there will always be split opinions. That concludes today's show. Thank you, Achebe,
Thank you.
and thank you, Watts.
Thank you.
Join us next week when we will be discussing symbolism and consciousness in Virginia Woolf's infamous novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Goodbye.